Hi, and welcome to another episode of Haltech's Technically Speaking. Today, we're going to be doing anatomy of a burnout car. We've got this thing here to go through. We've got Adrian Hodgson to come and tell us all about it. So let's have a look. Now, Adrian, before we go too far into the mechanicals of this thing, outside, I mean, she's no showpiece. Can you tell me a little bit about why you chose this car?
So, at Summernats 30, start of 2017, we brought Farmtruck and AZN out to Australia just to experience the Summernats event, have a great time, and see how we do it in Australia. We got a great reaction from them being here and wanted to bring them back, but they basically pulled the handbrake on and said, listen, we're terrible spectators. If we're coming back, we want a piece of the action. And this is as close to farm truck style as we could manage so that they could have fun at Summernats.
And the first thing they said was, a car like theirs, burnouts.
So it's a 1969 Chevrolet C10. It differs from the farm truck that you might have seen on the show in that it's a short box. So it's about 14 inches shorter in the bed than the race farm truck, which is a deliberate choice on their part so that it can make better use of the burnout pad without smacking walls.
Okay, so they've put real effort into it to make sure they're actually going to be competitive at Summernats. First things first, the stock engine in this thing wasn't going to cut it. What used to be down in here?
When the truck got to Australia, it had an original 1969 inline 6 engine in it. It ran, but not well, and certainly not well enough to do a burnout.
So 50 horsepower of something or other.
It probably had 50 horsepower at one point, yeah.
All right, so now let's get into this. Magnuson supercharged along the top of it. What have you put in?
So basically it's a 6-litre LS2 like you might find in a VE SS Commodore. It's just had a bit of a freshen up, so inside there's some new pistons and rod bolts, but basically it's just like a late model Commodore engine.
Okay, so in our country in Australia we would get that in our Holden Commodore, the 6-litre V8, so it's quite a late model engine.
Yep.
Parts for this, sourcing parts for this, what did you put into it and what's bolted on top of it?
So parts for this are really easy. So inside the engine, it's off-the-shelf stuff. So an off-the-shelf camshaft from VCM and some forged pistons and just preventative maintenance. You know, we're going to lean on it a little bit harder than maybe the factory intended. So stuff like that to give it some strength.
So rods, pistons, bolts, that sort of stuff. Well, pistons may or may not power.
Yep.
Did you change compression ratio with the pistons?
They're basically standard. But forged, so a little bit stronger. Essentially, this is a Magnuson supercharger kit to suit a Holden Commodore or a General Motors SS, a GMSS or a Pontiac G8. It's an off-the-shelf kit.
Super convenient. And what sort of boost does it run?
It's only running about £6, so it's very low, but it adds just enough extra horsepower to pop tyres.
Right, and one of the things that we know about superchargers is that the boost increases with RPM. So as the boost comes up, I assume there's some type of a pressure relief or a pop-off valve that's holding us at your 6 pounds of boost pressure.
There is. Just in the top of the intake here, there's a blow-off valve, essentially a bypass, so that once it's making that boost that we like to see, it'll actually bleed off any extra.
Right, so 6 pounds of boost. Importantly, 6 pounds, 6-litre engine. How much power does it make?
On a chassis dyno, it made about 530 horsepower, and it made it everywhere.
All right, it's a good point that you bring up. It makes it everywhere. Burnout cars need power. They need a lot of throttle response. So when you say it makes it everywhere, what does that mean?
Basically, turbo cars in a burnout situation might not work as well as a supercharged car or a really responsive naturally aspirated engine, because you need to be able to play with the throttle to get the car to steer where you need it to steer and to do what you need it to do with the rear tyres.
Okay, so on this particular setup, you say it's got 550 horsepower, somewhere around there, but the beauty of having this supercharged and having the 6-litre engine, it's probably got, what, 400 or 500 horsepower from, what, 3,000 RPM, something like that. So if you put your foot down from 3,000 to 8,000 RPM, it's gonna have 400 horsepower no matter what.
That's right, and a lot of people think that you need a giant towering engine to build a successful burnout car. There's plenty of competitors out there that have proved that you don't. What a supercharger does, maybe in tight situations where you've got to get out of contact with a wall, or if you have to steer it with the rear end, it gives you that throttle response to get out of those situations and use all of the burnout pad.
All right, so look, while we're on the style of the Burnout, I suppose, I don't know a lot about the Burnout comps. Can you tell me a few things about what makes a good Burnout? When you've got a car like this, what wins Burnout comps?
Burnout competitions are judged along similar lines across the country. So you need instant smoke, so that from the moment you hit the throttle, there needs to be plenty of smoke. You need constant smoke for the duration of the burnout, so at no time should there be a lack of smoke. You should be producing it the whole time.
Right.
You need a terrific volume of smoke, so there should be lots. That's pretty self-explanatory. And then there's a major element of driver skill, using all of the burnout pad, not sitting still and doing a static burnout, and getting into all of those corners, and then of course getting the tyres off at the end.
Right, okay, and what about things like bouncing it hard off the rev limiter, or do you want to hold it smooth, or what's the engine note? What are we looking for there?
It depends if you ask a fan or a judge. Now the judges tend to like good throttle control, because that means you're not just flooring it hard against the stop and hanging on. A lot of the fans do like rev limiter though, especially with LS engines.
All right. This car sits on the rev limiter for a minute or two at a time, 8,000 RPM. Thermal management must be so important in this thing. So can you tell me a bit about how you keep it cool?
So we have to approach it in a couple of different ways. The first is making sure there's a large capacity radiator with some really good thermo fans on it to keep the engine temperature under control. Secondly, we have to keep, like on a turbo car with an intercooler, we have to keep the charge temp of the air going into the engine cool. So for that, we've got a separate intercooler for the supercharger.
All right, this is an interesting thing because we've got a water to air intercooler on the front of the car here. The thing's supercharged. So where's this chilled water going? How's that working in here?
So basically there's a heat exchanger that lives in between the supercharger and the intake manifold of the engine. And it pumps cooled water or coolant through it to keep that intake charge cool.
Okay, so almost like a sandwich plate between the blower and the intake manifold.
Exactly, yeah.
What a fantastic idea. Yeah. And what sort of intake temps, with that setup, after a big burnout, what sort of intake temps do you expect to see in this thing?
Look, it gets up there, maybe 60, 65, 70 degrees on a cooler day.
Right.
It can get hotter when it's a bit of a warmer day.
Mate, and without this, geez, it'd be terrifying to think what it could get to.
Yeah, a lot of burnout cars don't necessarily run an intercooler, but they'll run on methanol, which makes it cooler in and of itself. This engine's on E85, so we get a little bit of that, but we have to make up for it with this.
It seems like a pretty delicate recipe to keep this thing revving, keep it at the right operating temperature, but as well as not carrying a whole bunch of extra water or fans or stuff that is increasing the weight of the car.
Yeah, so this car starts out pretty heavy anyway, so we had that to deal with from the get-go. We actually got the cooling wrong the first time round. For whatever reason, it was getting quite hot. Farmtruck AZN had a go on the burnout pad and it overheated. But you know, it was a car that was built in about a week. But the engine protection in the Haltech saved it. It recognised that it had reached a threshold and saved the engine to skid another day.
Geez, that's a lucky thing. It'd be horrible to come from another country to come and skid your car only to cook it on the first burnout.
Yeah.
So when that happened, what sort of temperatures was it running?
So we set the cutoff to be about 230 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's at about 115, 120 maybe.
Yeah, it's pretty up there.
Yeah, so our advice from our burnout competitors and our team leader on the project, Phil Kurgene, was that LSs tend to like a little bit of temperature. You can let them go a little bit further than some other engines in burnout competitions and they do recover. So we did set that hard limit there where it would shut the car off. But what we did before that was actually set a lower threshold where if it reached that temperature, it'd actually pull the throttle back. This uses an e-throttle, so we can save the engine from getting to that point in the first place.
Perfect. Okay, so what Adrian's talking about, there is multiple levels of engine protection. So I guess the guys would have felt the throttle sort of back a little bit, or just not have as much grunt as they did.
Yep.
Don't care. Keep into it. Then we have to use force. We have to rev limit the thing early or shut it down to save the engine. To get this thing to flip around, what sort of transmission and rear end is it using?
So it's the tried and tested General Motors Power Glide. It's a simple 2-speed automatic. It's just a no-brainer for this kind of thing.
It just works. And cooling problems in that? You have any dramas trying to keep that thing cool?
No, good quality fluid in the transmission. A large transmission cooler, which we've positioned up the back underneath the bed with a fan on it to get the air through it.
Right, so more volume, it's got a proper cooler on it. Mate, like you said, tried and tested, that thing will go forever.
That's right.
What about the rear end?
So the rear end, generally in these trucks, is pretty good, but the axles are a little bit spindly. We didn't want to have the drama, so we basically exchanged that for a Ford 9-inch rear end with 31 spline axles and no brakes.
No brakes at all on the rear?
Yep.
So even handbrake for parking, anything like that, nothing at all?
In Burnouts, rear brakes are surplus to requirements. You'll often see cars that aren't full-time Burnout cars on the pad because there is a lot of brake use to navigate your way around the pad. They get really hot, they can catch fire. This car's a dedicated Burnout vehicle, don't need them.
All right, and back to the judging on that, what do the judges think about holding brakes for a long period of time, a short period of time? What's the story there?
The idea is to make as much smoke as you can, not stop, not have to reverse. So constant movement of the vehicle, tons of smoke, and hopefully a happy crowd. So
a full power skid, but we can just dab the brakes to put us in the right direction or to slow it down if we need to.
That's right. The vehicles aren't going at high speed, but they are supposed to move the whole time and use the entirety of the pad.
Mate, I'm learning so much about Burnout cars. How about, let's get inside, we'll look in the cockpit and see what you need inside in order to rip a massive skid. Now, Adrian, the first thing that I noticed when we come in the cabin here is the look of it. Sometimes we describe something like this as pre-loved, just run in, ready for restoration. Mate, what category are we in? What's going on in here?
It's probably closer to not worth restoring. It's had a life. Can we say that, in its 50 years?
Somebody has certainly loved this car a lot for a very long time.
Yeah, there was an awful lot of rust in the car when it arrived in Australia, and in fact the floor in the cabin, the firewall and both rocker panels on the side had to be made because they just didn't exist.
Wow, and if I look down here where my feet are, we're covered in Oklahoma number plates. There are some rubber mats. And under there, you say it's all new. You've had to weld in a whole bunch of just new footwells, new everything.
Yeah, it was structurally sound when it got here, but we don't want holes in firewalls for safety reasons.
Makes sense for sure. And I suppose being a Burnout car, that the name is fairly important. Firewall. Odds of this car catching on fire probably higher than your average road car, I would guess.
Yeah, it's about getting in front of it and doing everything you can to be safe. So that's what we did.
Right. As far as the business, we've got a nice start button, factory set of keys, very classy.
Yep.
We've got the race pack dash. So what are we looking at on the dash here? What are the most important things to be looking at?
So some of the things that we spoke about in relation to engine protection, whether they're a problem or not, it's still a good idea to have an idea what they are. So we want to know that the engine's warmed up for engine coolant temp and also for oil pressure. These cars have a pretty hard life, and then over time what we do is when we start it, we check the oil pressure and just keep an eye on it. After 20 burnouts, if the oil pressure is starting to go down, the engine might need a little bit of a birthday. If it's not, we know things are probably smooth sailing.
Yeah, good health check. It's a really good idea. Down here, not much going on. We've got an electronic throttle pedal. What type of car is the electronic throttle pedal out of?
It's actually out of a Subaru BRZ, Toyota 86, that kind of thing. It was just a handy throttle pedal that we had access to.
If it was lying around, it looks like it's at about the same height as the brake pedal. It feels nice and goes to the floor, so can't ask much more than that.
Yep. We've
got our brake pedal, as like you said before, when I'm pressing this whole brake pedal, we're only doing 2 front calipers. That's it.
Yep.
It's still getting me. Still getting me.
We've got some nice big brakes on the front, so they're Willwood 6-piston calipers. They stop it pretty well, certainly well enough to be a burnout car. You wouldn't use it on the street with only 2 brakes, but it only needs the 2.
Right. All you'll need. Moving across, shifter, 2-speed, simple, on a nice pole here so I can get it at the right height.
The shifter itself is pretty simple. It's all the way back for first gear. Generally, as soon as you smash the throttle in first gear, you're sticking it into top straight away, and then you won't touch the shifter again for the duration of the burnout. So it's
that's
full
all the
throttle,
way back,
top gear,
full throttle, top
done.
gear, 8 grand, let it rip. One of the things to note in this build is that the whole car has been rewired. So if we crack open the glove box here, we'll pull the duct tape back a little bit. Everything in there, all the fuses, all the relays, the harness is really laid out beautifully so that if we do have any problems while we're on the burnout pad, at least we can go through and diagnose them quickly and get them straight back on the track. This is something that the wiring, always the heart of the installation. It's so important to get it right, so it's not worth cutting corners or something like that. That's all we've got for today. So thanks very much for coming along on this journey and checking out the SkidTruck with me. I know I've learned a lot. So Adrian, thanks so much for coming past and checking it out with us. As always, thanks very much for watching. My name's Scott, and I'll see you next time.